forum. Ordinarily, when we're meeting in person, it's a cowbell, but today it's a Christmas bell. It's just broke. Sorry.
Oh, no.
Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Our guest today, and we're very happy to have her, is Judith E.B. Roberts. Judith serves as ELCA Program Director for Racial Justice. The ELCA Racial Justice Ministry educates, equips, and engages leaders to analyze the systems of racism and identify solutions that create equitable outcomes within and outside the ELCA. Through partnerships with synods, congregations, associations, and agencies, Racial Justice supports training and education in the areas of anti-racism and racial justice. Judith is the former Director of Adult Programs for the National Conference for Community and Justice of Connecticut and Western Massachusetts, a human relations organization dedicated to fighting bias, bigotry, and racism in America. She also worked for the William Winter Institute for Racial Reconciliation at the University of Mississippi. Judith received a BS in Human Services from Springfield College in Springfield and an MA in American Studies from the University of Mississippi. She was raised in the Lutheran faith and worships at Grace Lutheran in Evanston, Illinois. So would you join me in welcoming her this morning? Welcome, so glad to have you, Judith. Oh, and one other thing, please mute yourself unless you are asking a question or responding. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. Just give me 1 second while I get ready to share my screen with you all. Okay, are you able to see my screen?
No, we're not.
Okay, hold on 1 more second. Let me check.
Now we can see it.
Perfect, wonderful. Okay, well, I am so happy to join you this morning. I am actually in Connecticut with my family, working remotely. And so I'm handling some technical difficulties with a church council meeting that my mother is attending. So apologies, I'm trying to multitask here. But it's so good to be with all of you. And thank you for the introduction, Pastor. I really appreciate that. So I always bring a little bit of my story into our story when I have an opportunity to share across our church. And I would like to acknowledge my maternal grandfather, and those are the shoulders on which I stand. You see before you a picture of C.C. Bryant, my mother's father, and he served as the president of the Pike County National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He served in that post as president for 30 years, from 1954 to 1984. And even though I have northern roots, born here in Connecticut and raised, I spent every summer with my maternal grandparents in Mississippi. And it is on my grandfather's shoulders that I really believe that the seed for justice work was planted in my story, in my heart. And today he is remembered as part of the Mississippi Freedom Trail. And the other little nugget is that my grandfather shares the birth date with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. So his birthday celebration will take place on this Monday in the town of Macomb, where they will also honor Dr. King. And lastly, even though he has a significant role in the Mississippi freedom struggle, it was really his faith that for me was what I saw. As I did my research on my grandfather's contribution, it really boiled down to his faith for justice. Which brings me to our ELCA baptismal covenant. When I entered into this work for our denomination in 2011, I remember the importance of going back to our baptismal covenant to really give me that strength of why we as a church are called to strive for justice and peace in all the earth. And that becomes just my centering. And I always just like to remind myself and to kind of center any community that I'm part of, whether it's an ELCA community or another sector, that I bring our baptismal covenant forward. And if you'd like to read it with me, you're welcome to, but I always recite it. We are called to live among God's faithful people, to hear the word of God and share in the Lord's Supper, to proclaim the good news of God in Christ through word and deed, to serve all people following the example of Jesus, and strive for justice and peace in all the earth. Amen. So you heard a little bit about my portfolio and how I serve on behalf of our denomination. And I would also like to draw our attention as a learning community that this work really stems from our church's commitment in its social teachings. Freed in Christ, race, ethnicity, and culture was one of the early social statements adopted by our denomination. The language in this text and this document are still relevant for us today. It called our church to confess the sin of racism. It called this church to confront white privilege and white supremacy. It called this church to create and to support ethnic specific ministries and congregations. And it called this church to work for racial justice. And so our commitments go right back to one of the early foundational documents adopted in 1993. You heard a little bit about the work that I carry. I serve on behalf of the ELCA in ecumenical spaces. One of the most, I guess one of the biggest tables or the most impactful space that I've been part of is the National Council of Churches, where I have been a co-convener for their justice and advocacy table. And I've worked for racial justice on behalf of our church in that space with other leaders. We did an event called Act Now, to confront racism. We held an event in 2018 in Washington, D.C. for a part of public service in honor of Dr. King's legacy. Just different ways that we as church work with other leaders to express the work of justice. Resource development, which is what we're going to talk about a little today, is also part of my portfolio. That when we issue statements or prepare educational materials, that is also part of my portfolio that I do collaboratively across our denomination. And that collaboration, for the most part, I work within our church-wide office as a church of three expressions that are not hierarchical, but are all interdependent. I'm in the church-wide expression, so much of what I do is in collaboration with my colleagues at the church-wide office. And then we certainly work collaboratively with our congregations, our 9,300 congregations, and our 65 synods. So I can kind of go on and on about the depth and the breadth of all the work that we do, but I just wanted to kind of give you more of that important framing. And even though we're leading with racial justice through my portfolio, we also have Justice for Women. Many of you may know Dr. Mary Strayford, who heads up that particular portfolio, that we name as a church all of the systemic inequities within our own institution and in the structures that we live in. And so we know that oppression does not just end with race and gender. We know that it intersects with identity. So for example, when I think about my own experiences of oppression, I do it from the lens of my race and my gender identity. But we know that there is economic oppression. We know that the LGBTQIA community continues to experience oppression. We know of people who are undocumented in our country. So we know that there are many layers to unpack, and the work that we do across our denomination tries to touch on all of those different aspects of oppression. And so just to give you some background about the artwork that I've included, this work was a creation of an African artist, and he took different words and different language to kind of express the experiences of people who've been marginalized and people who've been hurt, whether that was about religion or about their sexual orientation, their gender identity, or it was about poverty or whatever the topic was. But he just created this art piece, and I have incorporated into my work lately because it just makes me remember that all oppression is connected. And we may focus on one aspect, but we certainly do not do it to minimize other forms of oppression. So I mentioned the Freed in Christ document that our social statement that we adopted. It lifted up and amplified the many different expressions from ethnic specific communities that are Lutheran in our church. And there are ministries that represent each one of those communities, their desk, that staff the ministries, and their responsibilities are for leadership development and for helping to build and support congregations within each one of those ethnic communities. And I have the privilege to serve with those colleagues at Churchwide. We have the American Indian Alaska Native Desk, African Descent Ministries, African National Ministries or Network, which is the picture here in the right-hand corner, our Arab and Middle Eastern Ministries, Asian Pacific Islander, and our Latino Latinx ministries. And so their voices to help support our church becoming more inclusive are found in these strategy documents and plans. And synods are encouraged to read this strategy so you can gain a better insight as to how each community chooses to express itself and how our culture shows up in how we even read and understand our Lutheran identity. And yet there's some gaps, even though we call for this diversity to become multicultural in our church, that the communities of color have named inequitable issues within our structure. Sometimes it's the inequitable access to leadership roles and to resources such as funding. It may be just the lack of support for even supporting ethnic ministries across our 65 synods. It's also looking at how lay and roster leaders are identified and supported, and then understanding the economic challenges when many of our congregations of color exist in high poverty index communities, that the needs are so overwhelming. And so part of my portfolio under the title of racial justice has been to hear the voices of leaders of color from my colleagues who serve as staff, who staff the desks representing each community, and the associations. So we don't just stop with staff that work inside of the churchwide office that look at the grant funding and look at the places for most viable ministries. We also have ethnic associations representing all of those communities, and they have a voice in helping to carry out the mission of our church. So I work in multiple spheres. We do this work, as I mentioned, collaboratively with our leaders of color. And in addition to the communities of color, there is the European Descent Lutheran Association for Racial Justice, working specifically with white leaders in our church who are committed to anti-racism, and they work in conjunction with the ethnic leaders of our church. So I have to give you kind of all of this background as we move into the Declaration of People of African Descent. So there's some quick history. In 2019, the Declaration to People of African Descent was read from our churchwide assembly stage, and it was received by Reverend Lamont Wells, who is the president of the African Descent Lutheran Association, also known as ADLA. And if you have watched the YouTube video, you saw him on stage making remarks about receiving this declaration. We also condemned white supremacy and racist rhetoric as a church, that we made a formal commitment to continue to do that work. We also lifted up a commitment to host anti-racism. Let me take a step back. We lifted up a commitment to remember the victims of the Mother Emanuel 9 shooting and to host a Day to End Racism event. And so what you see in the middle is the pledge that we created to commit to anti-racism, and we lifted that up on June 17th, which is our annual gathering for the commemoration remembrance of the Mother Emanuel 9 victims. And then we also adopted a strategy towards authentic diversity, where the leaders of color of our church, they called our church to greater accountability, and this strategy was also adopted. So these are just kind of the actions that all took place in 2019. So how did we get here to the apology? Some background. In 2015, the African Descent Lutheran Association Biennial Assembly gathered in 2015, and a young seminarian whose name is Louis Tillman brought a document to the assembly, and he said that our church could do more in acknowledging the pains and the struggles of people of African descent. And the document did not pass at the assembly gathering, but it was referred to what is called the strategy team, the African Descent Strategy Team. And so that team works with the desk, the colleagues in churchwide. They also have voice from across the country, and they think about how can the church be much more influential in different aspects. I happen to sit at that team, and I sit at the justice table. And so this idea, this vision from this one person came to our table, and we said, well, let's put a little bit more meat to the bone on this resolution, or excuse me, on his document. And what came out of that was the memorials from the synods that went to the churchwide assembly in 2016, and we adopted the policy called, or social policy resolution called Renewed Action Regarding Racism Towards Lutherans of African Descent. So if you haven't seen this document, it's important that you see all of the language that was crafted in the document. It's it's a full page social policy resolution. And the apology, the declaration to people of African descent, was only one piece of this bigger plan of activity for our church. And so the drafters of the declaration included members of the ELCA Church Council. We had a representative from the Conference of Bishops, Bishop Bill Gohl, who serves as the Bishop of the Delaware, Maryland Synod. I mentioned to you the European Descent Lutheran Association for Racial Justice, white leaders in our church committed to anti-racism. We had representation from that table to help draft this, and we had staff as support. So Racial Justice, as my portfolio, African Descent Ministries were all part of the group that took on this challenge to create that one-page declaration. Now, I know we do lots of different work and we pass different documents all the time as a church. And just to add, there was a declaration to the Jewish community, which is what this initial request from this young seminarian called for. And his point was, the church has issued apologies in the past. I think this is an important step for us to heal and to grow and to name racism and also the legacy of slavery. So this kind of came from this young seminarian reading what our church had already committed itself to do. And if you haven't read the apology to the Jewish community, you can find that declaration online. And it specifically talks about Kristallnacht and the Lutheran Church's role in the Holocaust of our Jewish siblings. So in addition to having this go through the steps of our church, really doing its engagement from a leader to a strategy team to synods, memorializing churchwide, passing this resolution to actually drafting the language, we had to move towards some other pieces, such as the artwork. And the Sankofa image of the bird looking backward is reflective of Ghanaian culture and the Akan people. And what it means is this bird looking backward for her egg, if you see the little green egg, it means that you cannot look forward without looking back, that you have to remember your past and don't forget your past before you move ahead. And so it just speaks volumes of what the apology was calling for, that we can't really heal until we do our hard work of looking at the history of slavery in this country. So as we were gathering in Milwaukee for the churchwide assembly in August of 2019, Leaders were gathering in Virginia, and they were gathering at Port Comfort, which was part of the British colonies. It was one of the early forts that helped create what we know as Jamestown, but it was an actual British fort. And it tells the story of the very first arrival of enslaved Africans that came to the shores of what would become the United States. And they arrived in August of 1619, and it is documented in British records. They were traded for food, and they came to the shores of Virginia, what was known as the British colony of Virginia. They came to the shores, and the British soldiers traded with the Spanish food for the slaves. And so that was the arrival of the very first enslaved Africans. And if you go to Port Comfort in Virginia, there is a plaque that tells the story in brief. The community of Port Comfort, around Port Comfort, they continue to lift up August as a month to remember this history through storytelling, through reenactments, through different activities that talk about the journey of the first arrivals. And in addition to what happened in Virginia, the New York Times issued a series called the 1619 Project. It's also a podcast if you haven't had a chance to hear the work of Hannah Jones, but it's really helpful in giving more background to looking at 1619 as the kind of the beginning, the birth of our nation, and the role that enslaved people played. The Declaration to People of African Descent also names the International Decade for People of African Descent, which was a United Nations call to action. And this recognition of the decade, it really wants the whole world to understand the plight of people of African descent more globally, and also understand what slavery did to the continent and what colonization continues to bear out in the current status and the continent right now. What you have here in the bottom corner, this is a photo of all of the participants who helped draft the language of the apology, as well as members of the African descent leadership that were present on stage. So as I mentioned, the International Decade, looking globally at racial disparities, that we know that people of African descent, no matter where we are on the planet, that in terms of employment and housing and healthcare and the impact of criminal justice, that we continue to be highly represented with racial disparities in all of these communities. That anti-Black racism still continues to be a thing, and it doesn't matter where we look on the planet. And it also calls us to understand that slavery did not end. Human trafficking is still very much is invisible, but it's still very much in existence. So, connecting the dots. Even, the Declaration is speaking to the apology to people of African descent, and the 1619 Project specifically focused on the beginning of slavery in this country. Other people who have worked on 1619 initiatives have made sure that we can't forget to connect the dots, that slavery was an event, part of a bigger tapestry around the ways that people of color have experienced historic marginalization and pain in this country. And so all of our stories are woven into the bigger story in many different ways, right? And so we looked at the repudiation of the doctrine of discovery, which talks about the removal and genocide of our indigenous siblings. And that was an action taken in 2016 by our church, and the impact for our indigenous First Nations, American Indian, Alaska Native siblings in church and society. That we look at the impact of the Chinese Exclusion Act, where Chinese men could come here to the United States, but their families were forced to remain behind and they were denied citizenship. Or the Japanese internment of US citizens, where their property and possessions were taken. Or the exploitation of Mexican farm workers that continues to happen with migrant workers in this country. or the construction of whiteness that even when we think about slavery alongside those who were indentured servants, many of them who were Irish, how whiteness was even defined and who could be defined as white, that we can go back and look at our history that, for example, not even Irish people were able or considered to be full citizens and have full access and were given the same opportunities. And then, as I mentioned, even with the genocide and the Holocaust of our Jewish siblings through Nazi Germany, that there were lessons that Nazi Germany looked at from the United States. A lot of it was around the sterilization of people in this country, women of this country, who were considered to be unfit. And so, when we think about the white picket fence and a husband and a wife and the two children, that came from a belief, an ideology in our country. And it was around who should procreate and how many children should people have. And this was an anti-immigrant sentiment that stemmed from many people who happened to come from places like Italy, many people who happened to be Catholic, who had many children. And so we can kind of go back and look at how all of these dots around dehumanization and oppression are all connected. So the background information that was included in the declaration. So the declaration, as you know, is the one-pager, and then there were questions that we included to accompany the document. And that was intentional move because we didn't want the declaration to stand on its own. We knew that there would be questions from the wider church as to why we were doing this. People who said, I don't own slaves, why should we be talking about this? So I reached out to a thought leader who has worked on behalf of our church. Her name is Dr. Joyce Caldwell. She is an anti-racism teacher, educator, leader in the Greater Milwaukee Synod. And she's very much connected to Crossroads Ministries, Crossroads anti-racism work, if you're familiar with them. And Joyce is a friend and partner and has helped develop materials for our church in the past. Two resources that I want to highlight. One is called One Body, Many Members, and that is a tool for our church congregations to think about how we move out to meet our neighbors. How are we becoming much more multicultural? How are we becoming more inclusive? So it's if you haven't looked at the material, it's online under elca.org, and it includes videos, discussion materials, Bible studies. It's all meant for congregations to just kind of dig in wherever they are. To explore their own kind of history and background, and then to think about how we engage with folks who may not be part of our congregations. And this is for all congregations, that we all should be working to become more inclusive, whether that's around race, sexual orientation, or issues of class. The second resource that she helped design is called Troubling the Waters for Healing the Church, a resource for white congregations to lead and talk about white privilege. So I really just give thanks to Joyce for helping me who was a partner in helping to design that resource. And I know you have all had a chance to read that, and I'm happy to take some questions in a few minutes. I just want to kind of wrap up this part of our conversation with the last page of the document. The last page includes actions. Where do we go from here as a church? That we have to live into not just the apology, but we're called to look at the recommitment to African descent Lutheran lives. And what that means, it means that many of our congregations that experienced white flight during the 70s, that buildings were left behind when white leaders left and people of color moved into those spaces and became part of the Lutheran community. In some communities, some cases, that they were left behind with buildings that certainly are in deep need of repair today, and they just didn't have the resources to maintain some of these large structures. And so we need to find ways to kind of reinvest. Those ministries are very vital in the communities in which they serve. And as I mentioned, many are in impoverished communities, or communities experiencing high level of poverty, and they just don't have the resources to really stretch to cover cost of ministry and building maintenance. And so we're asking for ways that our church can think about that more strategically. We're also focusing on leadership development. that we want to encourage more seminarians of color to consider that path, to discern their path, and to support them. And so that's a major commitment that we are doing through Fund for Leaders, and how we are continuing to raise up leaders and supporting them through seminary, which is the cost has, as you know, has gone through the roof for many of them. We want the apology to be supported and to seriously be studied by our congregations. And I would add one more layer to the study of the apology. I think we need to encourage congregations to study slavery, and we need to start with that. It doesn't really matter what part of the country you're in, and that should not be an excuse for not studying the impact of slavery, but there's so much to learn about the history of slavery in our country, whether that's through documentary films or museums or books. But I think the 1619 Project gives us enough resources to start that work. But I don't want us to focus, it's only about the apology, it's about knowing that history. As I mentioned, June 17th was our, June 17th of 2020 was the first observance of an annual day of repentance against racism, which is the day that we remember the Emmanuel 9 victims. And so if you haven't participated in the June 17th events in the past, we encourage you to either look online at the worship service in the worship materials that we utilize in hopeful preparation for the coming June 17th Day of Remembrance. And you can also sign the pledge. And then lastly, the work of racial justice and anti-racism work, that's ongoing, and that does include the study of reparations. As a church, we have not produced materials to study reparations as of yet. There has been conversations at multiple levels about the study of reparations, and I can just kind of give you some broad strokes. The biggest piece that I can bring forward right now is the why. That we want leaders in our church, all people who are leaders, because we're all leaders, members of our church, to understand why reparations is important. We're not focusing on a monetary, value about reparations. We want people to understand the impact of what 400 years of a slave economy did to people of African descent, and what the theft of indigenous land did for our First Nations siblings. So it's really about telling the story and understanding the current realities and the legacy of ongoing systemic oppression. So it looks like I'm at my time for talking, and we can open this up for some conversation. So I will stop sharing my screen. And I know I've probably given you an awful lot. I'm happy to review anything that I may have missed. Oops, hold on a second. Make sure I stop sharing. So are you able just to see me right now, or?
Yes, you have stopped sharing.
Okay, wonderful. So let's open it up. I want to hear a little bit about what your congregation, I know you're committed to racial justice works. I'm happy for this to be a two-way discussion. So I'd love to hear what y'all are doing and anything you want to ask of me.
We started last June a racial justice team. And so we are working as a team and sub-teams on a number of things. Anyone can plug in here. That's just real general, but I think there are a number of people in our congregation that are really passionate about this. And so we're continuing our work. And other people can say more, but one thing I wondered was, have you gotten, what response have you gotten from ELCA congregations to this declaration? Have they done anything, or?
The declaration itself, I think it's just a mixed bag. I've received requests for congregations to lift it up, or synods to lift it up. We have paper copies. And so that has been that's one way I know that leaders are using it. They'll contact, say, we're doing an adult forum, just like what's
Right.
happening today, and we're utilizing it. Or for example, there was a Black History celebration last February, and one of the synods requested copies of the Declaration. And the reason why I have to kind of add a little bit more layers, I went on sabbatical shortly after Churchwide Synod, and then we went into COVID. So, it's just been,
Yeah.
it's been a little bit of a challenge to have or to kind of follow where congregations
Yeah.
with this because of COVID and kind of having the ship
Oh,
gear. But
Yeah, sure.
but there
Sure.
was great response in the beginning. There still continues to be response, and there's pushback. And I'll say more. I can be more specific. The pushback is less about the apology, and it's more about the one part about study preparations.
Mhm. Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. Yeah.
So I have, and I constantly have to go back and add that we have not called for study, we have not called for reparations. We've called for people to study reparations. And I have had consultations with our Conference of Bishops telling them that I think we need to take our time. Some synods are ready to go and come up with a figure. And I've shared with them that, I've consulted with the African descent community and leadership, and they're more concerned about building relationship and going through a process versus we think it's about a dollar amount. So, there have been proposals with dollar amounts and, suggestions, and that has been rejected so far.
Mhm. Yeah.
Judith,
I was going to say until, oh, go ahead, Bill.
I'm sure you are aware of this. One of the things that is a very, very convincing argument in favor of reparations is the article that Ta-Nehisi Coates did in The Atlantic about 5 years ago. And my wife and I saw him too when he was at Michigan State University, a sold out talk in a 2,300 seat auditorium, also concentrating on reparations. And I'm guessing that online, on YouTube, you can probably find him making this case too. But it's a tremendously compelling argument that he made, because of course people say right away, how could we ever afford this? They think only in terms of dollar amounts, not in terms of other options. So.
Yeah, understanding the definition of reparations, or all that reparations can and should encompass, is a huge first step. It's not just about money.
Exactly. And that was that too. I'm so glad you said that. That is part of the conversation that we have had with our bishops, is really having clear-cut language as to what we are talking about for reparations. We've been in that conversation. And I can add, if you haven't followed the work of the Episcopal Church, the Episcopal Church has had their own kind of reckoning with their complicity with the slave trade. And they have created funds that kind of fall into the bucket of reparations. They reported to the United Nations what their church is committed to do. But it has been a journey. It has been a decades plus long journey of them, first of all, understanding the wealth that was created by Episcopal members who are part of the slave trade. And if you haven't seen the documentary called Traces of the Trade, A Tale from the Deep North, and I'll give it to you again, Traces of the Trade, A Tale from the Deep North. It follows the story of my friend Katrina Brown, who was entering seminary in the Episcopal tradition, and she discovered her family's story of the slave trade. They were the largest slave trading family in U.S. history. And so the Episcopal Church has used her writings and her family journey as just one piece of kind of helping them process this thing around wealth, right? And I just encourage you to see it. It's about an hour and a half long documentary if you choose to view it. But that helped to also serve as a catalyst for congregations to do their own study around slavery, specifically in the North, because I'm from Connecticut. Many people don't believe that slavery happened in the North. That's one of the challenges with history, that there are slaves in Connecticut. And so slavery just ended sooner right, pre-Civil War. It didn't just occur in the North, but there were enslaved peoples here. So that's what happened. I can speak from Connecticut perspective. I was part of the Episcopal community's work for each congregation, their diocese, to do their own accounting of who owned slaves. And that included the slaves that were part of for parishioners as well as priests. So it was a truth-telling moment that they entered into, and they've done some work to create resources for Episcopal, African descent Episcopal seminarians to go to pursue their education at a zero cost. So that's just an action. You know, other institutions have looked at their own complicity, such as Georgetown, for example. Harvard is another one that is doing it, Brown University. So it's such a, you know, it's a large topic, you know, but I think institutional accountability and knowing our American history with that frame will be a first good step.
Hi, Julia. I just want, can you hear me?
I can. I'm just seeing.
Okay.
It's Debbie, right? Okay. I see.
Yeah, all right. This was a great presentation. Thank you very much. It was a very organized and a wealth of information that you and the team at the synod level had put together for congregations to be able to study. I was, something I really didn't know a lot about was the Sankofa bird. And I thought that your, the history, just the little history and the symbolism that was behind that really speaks so well to, you know, the purpose or the mission of learning about the history. And I just wondered if you have specific artwork or, you know, banners or posters that actually have the symbol and just a little succinct message about the history and what it means available for congregations or congregations to use in, you know, like maybe a file that we can put on something like cards or something that we'd use to communicate that.
You know, Debbie, I'm so glad. Thank you for your support of the work that we try to do. I'm so glad you reminded me about the Sankofa bird. So the artwork design, I have to wear lots of hats at church-wide, but we were looking for artwork. I work with our mission advancement unit, and anytime we produce documents from my team, and they came back and they said, what should we put on the cover? And I said, I think we can use the Sankofa image. And what we failed to do when we printed the document was to give the background. Like, I thought about it after the document because I was under a time crunch. This was done in like June, and I had to get it prepared for church-wide assembly, and I had like 4-week turnaround. So I had to get all the background information. We had to text edit it, and then we had to have this cover. So it went to print, and everything was proofed, and nothing about the Sankofa image. So thank you, Debbie, because we can go back to that Sankofa image. And I think you're right. We can maybe create some materials that accompany the apology with that Sankofa image. And I think that can be a great teaching resource that we can include like as a PDF file online. So thank you. I will put that back on my to-do list. That's very simple, but thank you for a good reminder. That's very helpful.
Great. Thank you.
Judith, I'm part of the racial justice team, and I really enjoyed your talk, but I'm wondering, does the ELCA ever bring up Desmond Tutu's plea for truth and reconciliation? Because to me, it seems that has to come either with or before reparation. Could you talk that?
Yes, you are so spot on, David. So what I didn't, there's so many layers to this. I'm just looking online. So here's some more background info. So after the shooting at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, the World Council of Churches made a pilgrimage to the United States. And their final convening happened at the ELCA Churchwide office, which I was part of, with several ecumenical domestic church, church members and members of the WCC from around the world. And we were called basically into accountability as the churches in the US. Like, this happened on our watch. As many of you know, Dylan Roof also has an ELCA affiliation, right? Connection. And what we were left with was the call to action to work on a Truth and Racial Reconciliation Commission. And what came from that was the event I mentioned in DC. So we kicked off kind of a national convening on the Mall on the end of 50th anniversary of Dr. King's death. And we created a group called Act Now to Confront Racism. And one of the next action steps was to create, or for the churches to begin, a Truth and Racial Reconciliation Commission. So we've had discussions through the National Council of Churches. One synod in particular that is taking this work, even taking it up, like really implementing it as we speak, is the Minneapolis Council of Churches. That they issued a statement this summer post the murder of George Floyd that said, they convened historic Black churches, mainline predominantly white churches, and they created this team to draft the document for the Truth and Racial Reconciliation convening. And so the NCC, National Council of Churches, hopefully we are applying for some funds. We're applying for grant dollars. So let's see what happens if we are able to receive some funding to do this. But you are so spot on. We also want to do this in alignment with the incoming administration, the Biden-Harris administration. There have been leaders within the Congressional Black Caucus who have called for, first of all, they want materials to even study reparations to be developed for our nation. And they also believe that it's not, this is, like you said, a longer journey, that they also are looking at how do we move to a Truth and Racial Reconciliation Commission. So it's happening at multiple levels. Let's see what happens. If there is an opportunity for NCC to be influential in how the new administration will lead this, because our faith leaders are calling for it in different places. So I appreciate you saying that. And hopefully it can become part of a national agenda. So when faith leaders say that collectively, that has weight in the national voice. So excellent.
Well, thank you very much. But I've become a firm believer that the root cause of all our unrest today, political, religious, you name it, goes back to racism.
It does.
And white supremacy in this country.
David, thank you. I just appreciate your engagement about this, because when we passed the resolution condemning white supremacy and racist rhetoric, we get emails and phone calls at Churchwide on the regular, Bishop Eden, myself, other leaders. And one of the major pushbacks was, well, we're not white supremacists, because people think we're talking about just those who have a history in this country, such as hate groups like the KKK, right? And what you're talking about is that ideology of white racial superiority. And here's the tension. It's deeply connected to Christianity. So it's not separate from Christian belief, right? We know that slavery was able to exist because of the church in this country, right? That slaves obey your master, how scripture was distorted and used and weaponized against people in this country. So to add more layers to it, the part of the bishop's team, we have a theological director who is working on creating the resources we need to do church engagement, because we have to start there, because too many of our members shut down. We can't even say white supremacy. The walls go up, they shut down. They're not familiar with the meaning. And so we have a lot of teaching work to do, but I feel like I'm in a safe space that we can really be transparent and helpful and supportive in this conversation. And I say that it's like a breath of fresh air for me to be with your group, because I'm usually on the other side. I'm usually at the place that we can't say this because our members will be upset or they don't understand, or we said something and our members are like mad. Like those are kind of the two settings. that I sometimes experience at church vibe. And I'm just doing a quick time check. I don't mean to, we're almost.
It's just about noon, Judith, but if it's okay with you to go a little bit longer, then we can take a few more questions.
How about if we go another 10, 15 minutes? Would that be okay?
It's
I
fine.
do have,
Yes,
I have a
absolutely.
family luncheon at around 1:30. I have a family luncheon to prepare for, so.
Okay, let's go. I'll keep track of the clock and we'll go another 10, 15
That
minutes.
sounds great.
One thing quickly I'll suggest to you, and you're probably aware of this, some of the people in this group have been a part of the racial justice reading group that our Bishop Satterley started. So we've done quite a few books. The most recent one was Cast, Isabel Wilkerson's Cast, and also Ibram X. Kendi's book, which was marvelous, especially when you did the connecting the dots, because Kendi does that beautifully too, about racism and so forth. I mean, that was
Bill, I'm sorry, Bill, which one? Which Kendi book? He has two. Which one?
How to Be an Anti-Racist.
Okay, got it. Sorry.
But the one that we started with was Waking Up White, which is kind of like, it seems to me like a real basic for a white person, you know, suddenly, because she was completely unaware of any of this, and then gradually began to see the discrimination and so forth. And that seems like, in some ways, it was a frustrating book to read because it seemed like it took her forever to get anywhere. But on the other hand, for most of us starting with so little knowledge of this and understanding of it, it is a really good one to start with. And then move on to Cast, I think, because that's just amazing.
I would add, so I have Waking Up White. I try to join book reads when I can. You know, I get different requests all the time. I can't do all of them, but I have Waking Up White. I'm with you. It's a long book. I think it was like 10 hours on my phone. And I think she does a great job of giving resources for folks to continue to learn. And I appreciate you lifting that up. So we have a reading list. I think we've created like a bibliography of resources, but I will make sure to add that your congregation has done Waking Up White, and you've done How to Be Anti-Racist. Bishop Eaton also did How to Be Anti-Racist. We didn't meet Dr. Kende, but the National Council of Churches hosted him for their keynote speaker in 2019. And so we all got a signed copy of How to Be an Anti-Racist. And so Bishop Eaton has read that. I have read that. I also read Stand from the Beginning. If you want to go deeper, he makes the connection about the construction of racism and anti-Black racism specifically, and white supremacy in that one. It's a denser read, but the scholarship is amazing if you have time to do that one. So that's a little bit more in the historical journey of unpacking info. Isabel Wilkerson, I don't know if you read her book, The Warmth of Other Suns. If you haven't, that one is really, for me, as a person of African descent, tracing my family's journey. She talks about the Great Migration from the South into how many families like mine found themselves in the North, and what they were fleeing against, only to come to the North and find other forms of discrimination. I've heard her lecture on Cast. I haven't read that one yet. I will do that one as my Audible read. I'll probably do it next month. And the only reason why we're just having conversations, I know I'm with friends, but the only reason why I was excited to read her book, but then I was on a faith call, a global faith call, maybe back in like October, and there were members of the Indian community that were critiquing her use of Cast. And so I just kind of put it on the back burner. But if I read for knowledge and reflection, but that just kind of hit me that there was some pushback from those who are South Asian and Indian community, that for her to liken the US experience to their experience, and that there was there is a challenge for that translation. So but if you agree, if you think it's worth read, I will definitely read it anyway. But
do. I definitely would say that. I think a lot of people begin with maybe thinking that the idea of likening our racial structure to caste was a stretch. But
Mhm.
I found, and I think others in our group found, that her argument is completely convincing by the end.
Okay.
And when
Okay.
she mentions right at the very beginning that when Martin Luther King went to meet with Dalits in India, he was introduced as an untouchable from America, which really struck him. And so, right from the start, that seems to help make the case that it's very similar. So
Very similar, to use that frame. She's not, and if you haven't read New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, when we were working on the criminal justice social statement, her book came out around that same time, and I referenced Dr. Alexander's work as well, and she talked about the caste system as well. That was the first time I heard that use. She was speaking about it specifically from the term of those who've been incarcerated, who come back into society and cannot reintegrate fully. They've served their time, but they remain as this under caste, or in our community, in our society, and that was part of like the recidivism. But she was the first person to kind of introduce that from a racial perspective, looking at it from criminal justice. But yes, I will definitely put that as my February book read or audible read.
I too, Judith, would totally agree with Bill said about caste. It's really eye and heart opening in ways that I had no idea.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Yes, she's amazing. I heard her lecture right before, like, I think in November. I heard her lecture online. There was a special event that I joined in. Just hadn't gotten to the book yet. So sorry, I'm taking up too much space.
No, that's okay.
Let's have some more conversation. What else can we share?
So Judith, sorry, Tom McCurdy here. I'm a member of our racial justice team as well. A quick note about caste. We have the intention of doing a 2-week forum book review of caste in May. At least that's what we're looking at. We've talked with Bill and Linda about getting that set up. I find the comment you made about the Asian or the Indian people of Indian extraction interesting, especially given the fact that Isabel Wilkerson did so much research in India and spent so much time talking to various caste members. So I think she was my impression is she was trying to be quite attuned to the origins of caste and how it crosses over to our racial economic experiences here in the United States. So that's just a quick observation. The education part of me can't let this go. I did put a video link in the chat about the doctrine of discovery, and it's kind of a long video, but I found some of it informative about the effects of the doctrine of discovery and how it led to the near extinction of the indigenous people in the United States. So it's in the chat for those of you that want to reference it.
Yes.
And then the other observation I want to make to you was you were talking about the ELCA and reparations and stuff. And one thing that jumped out at me is it seems like one of the things the ELCA could very easily use reparations for is to stand up some of these church buildings that need the economic support. So that I'd be interested in pursuing that. Thank you.
Oh, Tom, these were all great. So you're one of my super fans of the day, Tom, and I'm going to tell you why. Thank you for posting that link. That link was produced by the Anabaptist Mennonite community, the one that you lifted up. I have used that. So the year that we passed the repudiation of doctrine and discovery in 2016, I hosted a forum at Churchwide Assembly, and it was linking repudiation of doctrine and discovery with Black Lives Matter movement. And so we use that as the centerpiece of the conversation, this documentary. I'm with you. It's just so well done. We at Churchwide, we currently do not have a staff person filling the post of American Indian Alaska Native director. The position is still open. They're interviewing. So once that desk is fully staffed, then we can move towards the resources that we can hopefully develop. There is I apologize because I can't get the title up. But if I find it, I'll send it to you. There is a documentary that does kind of represent the American Indian Alaska Native experience within the ELCA. It was produced like in the 80s. And it talks about land rights and usage. So if I can find that, I would love to include it, because the American Indian Alaska Native, that's one of the resources that they have utilized. I had it on DVD when I first came to Churchwide a decade ago. Things have shifted. So that's just, I don't have DVDs anymore, but if I can find the link, I will definitely try to send that. But in the meantime, please, I encourage you to watch that particular documentary. I think it's just well done from the Mennonite faith community. Oh, just another side note, the day that I shared the documentary that Tom lifted up at the Churchwide Assembly, someone came up to me and they said, the Lutherans were responsible for the murder of Mennonites, right? Like there's some history that we have with the Mennonite community, Anabaptist community. I see Pastor shaking his head. And so I had to go back and do my homework because I didn't know that history. And then I went back and I saw that we apologized again. That's another apology that we had to issue about the role of religion in our faith. So I just adding that. In terms of creating the funding for African descent congregations, that is in that resolution that I mentioned, the African Descent Lutheran Lives Matter resolution, Tom. And but we need to be really, as a church, we have not put together any funding to do that as of yet. So I had a conversation with the director that manages that portfolio. We had a discussion about having either generating a campaign, like how will we do that? Because many of our congregations really are in struggle. How can that debt be forgiven or erased or grants given to assist? So thank you for wanting to be part of that. I'll have to share as we move forward if the church council or Churchwide Assembly takes a formal action, but that's on the table. That's a priority. So thank you so much.
Judith, 10 minutes after, maybe one more question, because
Yes.
I know you have to go.
Yeah.
I had a question. This is Carol Ford. If we want to write our legislators to support what the church is doing, do you have suggested subject lines and any suggested language that we could include to help support what Churchwide is doing? So
Carol, is there a particular action you're thinking about that you would like to get behind?
Like all of it.
Okay.
But I'm thinking like the reparations is an important thing, but just like.
So as I was sharing, we're in the early conversation with the Conference of Bishops about reparations, and there's actually a consultation that is scheduled for 2021 with our bishops. So Bishop Satterley, he will be part of receiving that information through the Conference of Bishops. And what we really need to do is hear from the bishops and congregational leaders as to how do we even have the conversation in settings. So that's kind of phase one. And I appreciate you thinking broader about how do we engage our legislative team and our leaders. I would say this: the Congressional Black Caucus brings together the leadership from the House and the Senate of Black leaders to set their agenda. And that caucus, CBC is what they go by. They have had public hearings, and they have had debates on the floor about reparations. So if it's possible, if you want to do it independent, you're right, we don't have the language drafted, and this is where it's going to get kind of tough. The Congressional Black Caucus wants support. Okay, so you're in the right direction. If you could reach out to your legislative leaders and just ask them about conversations about reparations, that our churches call for the study. You can just use generic language. You can say our churches call for the study of reparations as part of our witness. Could I learned more about how your office is going to support reparations, just start the conversation about engagement. And the reason why I say it gets sticky is because the leaders of African descent really want our church to not skip over the hard work of doing the study. And that's really doing the engagement. And that's one reason why we kind of had to take a little step back and listen to leaders of color who are saying, of the African descent community who are saying, we don't want a quick fix. We really want our own church to own this. And we know that too many of our congregations can't even say the R word without a fight, whether that's race or reparations. So, we kind of said, let's be clear about who we are first and why we're doing it, which is why I'm engaging our bishops and having conversation with them as to what are the best ways for them to get behind this and roll this out. Can they host forums like y'all are doing? I don't know if it's only your congregation represented, but I know you extended it to the Synod. Bishop Satterley, he's just an amazing leader in our church, specifically around disability ministries. So we got to really kind of set the table for us. But I appreciate that question, Carol. And we can prime the pump by putting it on the table now, and we'll see what happens under the new administration if they seriously move this up. So I don't know.
Judith, we hate to let you go, but it is just about quarter after. It is exactly quarter after now. Thank you. This was a phenomenal presentation. And we will keep in touch with you because, you've been inspiring. So thank you very much. I hope your luncheon goes well. I hope your luncheon went well.
I do too.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Judith. Our ELCA is just blessed to have you as one of its key leaders. And, through some contacts I've had, there is so much expertise and passion by our ELCA leaders. I know Catherine Laurie has been wonderful with me about some things dealing with this. Karen Opolinski, so you guys are doing really good work. I don't think our congregations realize how much you do for our whole church. So thank you from the bottom of my heart for being here today.
Well, can I just give that love right back to all of you? Miriam convinced me to come, and I said, I always feel so overwhelmed, but this is where I also get renewed, being in community. And the folks you named are my teammates, Catherine and Kristen. We serve together. I have to give you some new news. I will be leaving the position of Racial Justice Director as of February 1st. However, I am moving into a new role at ChurchRide around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So there will be a new director for racial justice. And I'm leaving this conversation of thinking about all of the pieces that will still need support. And that's part of the bigger vision. Like, this work has to grow. We need more leaders. I'm one person, 65 synods serving ecumenically in-house. You can imagine that's a lot for one staff person. But there are pieces that are so important that we can't drop. And what you are doing, keeping your eye on the prize and the things that your congregation are monitoring. We need more. If I had 9,299 more of you, life would be so much better for us, but that's where the direction we're moving in. So my email will remain the same. You can certainly reach out to me, and just blessings and pray for the new director as that person steps into this role to continue to guide our church. And I look forward to continuing serving you from a different place, but we're still one church. So I
wish you all the best with the new position.
Yeah, definitely.
So much, and we'll stay in touch with you, I promise.
Yes.
Judith, thank you very much for your presence with us today. This is really helpful, and I'm grateful for you being here. So thank you very much, and we wish you well in your new position.
Well, thank you.
And your continued ministry.
Can you come back next week?
I was actually going to say next year, maybe once you've been in the new position for a while. It would be wonderful to have you come and do a forum with us again, if you're willing.
Absolutely. That sounds wonderful.
Okay, great. We'll keep in touch about that. Thank you.
There's got to be food involved.
God bless everyone. Take care.
Take care.